I have not transgressed, I have not been weak, I have not defaulted. I have not committed that which is an abomination to the gods, I have not caused the slave to be ill-treated of his master. I have not starved any man, I have not made any to weep, I have not assassinated any man, I have not caused any man to be treacherously assassinated, and I have not committed treason against any. I have not in aught diminished the supplies of temples, I have not spoiled the showbread of the gods. I have not taken away the loaves and the wrappings of the dead, I have done no carnal act within the sacred enclosure of the temple, I have not blasphemed, I have in naught curtailed the sacred revenues, I have not pulled down the scale of the balance, I have not falsified the beam of the balance, I have not taken away the milk from the mouths of sucklings, I have not lassoed cattle on their pastures, I have not taken with nets the birds of the gods, I have not fished in their ponds, I have not turned back the water in its season, I have not cut off a water channel in its course, I have not put out the fire in its time, I have not defrauded the 9 gods of the choice part of the victims, I have not ejected the oxen of the gods, I have not turned back the god at his coming forth. I am pure, I am pure, I am pure, I am pure, pure as this great Bonu of Heracleopolis is pure. There is no crime against me in this land of the double truth. Since I know the names of the gods who are with thee in the hall of the double truth, save thou me from them. He then turned towards the jury and pleaded his case before them. They had been severally appointed for the cognizance of particular sins, and the dead man took each of them by name to witness that he was innocent of the sin which that one recorded. His plea ended, he returned to the supreme judge, and repeated, under what is sometimes a highly mystic form, the ideas which he had already advanced in the first part of his address. Hail unto you, ye gods who are in the great hall of the double truth, who have no falsehood in your bosoms, but who live on truth in Aunu, and feed your hearts upon it before the Lord God who dwelleth in his solar disk. Deliver me from the Typhon who feedeth on entrails, O chiefs. In this hour of supreme judgment, grant that the deceased may come unto you, he who hath not sinned, who hath neither lied, nor done evil, nor committed any crime, who hath not borne false witness, who hath done naught against himself, but who liveth on truth, who feedeth on truth. He hath spread joy on all sides, men speak of that which he hath done, and the gods rejoice in it. He hath reconciled the God to him by his love, he hath given bread to the hungry, water to the thirsty, clothing to the naked, he hath given a boat to the shipwrecked, he hath offered sacrifices to the gods, sepulchral meals unto the manes. Deliver him from himself, speak not against him before the Lord of the dead, for his mouth is pure, and his 2 hands are pure. In the middle of the hall, however, his acts were being weighed by the assessors. Like all objects belonging to the gods, the balance is magic, and the genius which animates it sometimes shows its fine and delicate little human head on the top of the upright stand which forms its body. Everything about the balance recalls its superhuman origin. A cynocephalus, emblematic of thought, sits perched on the upright and watches the beam. The cords which suspend the scales are made of alternate cruces ansato and tots. Truth squats upon one of the scales. Thought, ibis-headed, places the heart on the other, and always merciful, bears upon the side of truth that judgment may be favourably inclined. He affirms that the heart is light of offence, inscribes the verdict of the proceeding upon a wooden tablet, and pronounces the verdict aloud. Thus saith Thought, Lord of the divine discourse, scribe of the great Aeneid, to his father Osiris, Lord of eternity. Behold the deceased in this hall of the double truth, his heart hath been weighed in the balance in the presence of the great genii, the lords of Hades, and been found true. No trace of earthly impurity hath been found in his heart. Now that he leaveth the tribunal true of voice, his heart is restored to him, as well as his eyes and the material cover of his heart, to be put back in their places each in its own time, his soul in heaven, his heart in the other world, as is the custom of the followers of Horus. Henceforth let his body lie in the hands of Anubis, who presideth over the tombs. Let him receive offerings at the cemetery in the presence of Onofris. Let him be as one of those favourites who follow thee. Let his soul abide where it will in the necropolis of his city, he whose voice is true before the great Ennead. In this negative confession, which the worshippers of Osiris taught to their dead, all is not equally admirable. The material interests of the temple were too prominent, and the crime of killing a sacred goose or stealing a loaf from the bread offerings was considered as abominable as calumny or murder. But although it contains traces of priestly cupidity, yet how many of its precepts are untarnished in their purity by any selfish ulterior motive? In it is all our morality in germ, and with refinements of delicacy often lacking among peoples of later and more advanced civilizations. The god does not confine his favor to the prosperous and the powerful of this world, he bestows it also upon the poor. His will is that they be fed and clothed, and exempted from tasks beyond their strength, that they be not oppressed, and that unnecessary tears be spared them. If this does not amount to the love of our neighbor as our religions preach it, at least it represents the careful solicitude due from a good lord to his vassals. His pity extends to slaves. Not only does he command that no one should ill-treat them himself, but he forbids that their masters should be led to ill-treat them. This profession of faith, one of the noblest bequeathed to us by the Old World, is of very ancient origin. It may be read in scattered fragments upon the monuments of the first dynasties, and the way in which its ideas are treated by the compilers of these inscriptions proves that it was not then regarded as new, but as a text so old and so well known that its formulas were current in all mouths, and had their prescribed places in epitaphs. Was it composed in Mendes, the god's own home, or in Heliopolis, when the theologians of that city appropriated the god of Mendes and incorporated him in their Ennead? In conception it certainly belongs to the Osirian priesthood, but it can only have been diffused over the whole of Egypt after the general adoption of the Heliopolitan Ennead throughout the cities. As soon as he was judged, the dead man entered into the possession of all his rights as a pure soul. On high he received from the universal Lord all that kings and princes here below bestowed upon their followers, rations of food, and a house, gardens, and fields to be held subject to the usual conditions of tenure in Egypt, i.e., taxation, military service, and the corvée. If the island was attacked by the partisans of Sit, the Osirian doubles hastened in body to repulse them, and fought bravely in its defence. Of the revenues sent him by his kindred on certain days and by means of sacrifices, each gave tithes to the heavenly storehouses. Yet this was but the least part of the burdens laid upon him by the laws of the country, which did not suffer him to become enervated by idleness, but obliged him to labour as in the days when he still dwelt in Egypt. He looked after the maintenance of canals and dikes, he tilled the ground, he sowed, he reaped, he garnered the grain for his lord and for himself. Yet to those upon whom they were incumbent, these posthumous obligations, the sequel and continuation of feudal service, at length seemed too heavy, and theologians exercised their ingenuity to find means of lightening the burden. They authorized the manes to look to their servants for the discharge of all manual labour, which they ought to have performed themselves. Barely did a dead man, no matter how poor, arrive unaccompanied at the eternal cities. He brought with him a following proportionate to his rank and fortune upon earth. At first they were real doubles, those of slaves or vassals killed at the tomb, and who had departed along with the double of the master to serve him beyond the grave as they had served him here. A number of statues and images, magically endued with activity and intelligence, was afterwards substituted for this retinue of victims. Originally of so large a size that only the rich or noble could afford them, they were reduced little by little to the height of a few inches. Some were carved out of alabaster, granite, diorite, fine limestone, or moulded out of fine clay and delicately modelled. Others had scarcely any human resemblance. They were endowed with life by means of a formula recited over them at the time of their manufacture, and afterwards traced upon their legs. All were possessed of the same faculties. When the god who called the Osirians to the corvée pronounced the name of the dead man to whom the figures belonged, they arose and answered for him, hence their designation of respondents, ashibiti. Equipped for agricultural labour, each grasping a hoe and carrying a seed bag on his shoulder, they set out to work in their appointed places, contributing the required number of days of forced labour. Up to a certain point, they thus compensated for those inequalities of condition which death itself did not efface among the vassals of Osiris, for the figures were sold so cheaply that even the poorest could always afford some for themselves, or bestow a few upon their relations, and in the islands of the blessed, fellah, artisan, and slave were indebted to the Ashbiti for release from their old routine of labour and unending toil. While the little peasants of stone or glazed ware dutifully toiled and tilled and sowed, their masters were enjoying all the delights of the Egyptian paradise in perfect idleness. They sat at ease by the waterside, inhaling the fresh north breeze, under the shadow of trees which were always green. They fished with lines among the lotus plants, they embarked in their boats, and were towed along by their servants, or they would sometimes deign to paddle themselves slowly about the canals. They went fowling among the reed beds, or retired within their painted pavilions to read tales, to play at draughts, to return to their wives who were forever young and beautiful. It was but an ameliorated earthly life, divested of all sufferings under the rule and by the favour of the true-voiced Onofris. The feudal gods promptly adopted this new mode of life. Each of their dead bodies, mummified and afterwards reanimated in accordance with the Osirian myth, became an Osiris, as did that of any ordinary person. Some carried the assimilation so far as to absorb the god of Mendes, or be absorbed in him. At Memphis, Ptah Sokaris became Ptah Sokar Osiris, and at Thinis, Kodamenephik became Iris Kodamenetit. The sun god lent himself to this process with comparative ease, because his life is more like a man's life, and hence also more like that of Osiris, which is the counterpart of a man's life. Born in the morning, he ages as the day declines, and gently passes away at evening. From the time of his entering the sky to that of his leaving it, he reigns above as he reigned here below in the beginning, but when he has left the sky and sinks into Hades, he becomes as one of the dead, and is, as they are, subjected to Osirian embalmment. The same dangers that menace their human souls threaten his soul also, and when he has vanquished them, not in his own strength, but by the power of amulets and magical formulas, he enters into the fields of Lalu, and ought to dwell there for ever under the rule of Onofris. He did nothing of the kind, however, for daily the sun was to be seen reappearing in the east 12 hours after it had sunk into the darkness of the west. Was it a new orb each time, or did the same sun shine every day? In either case the result was precisely the same: the god came forth from death and re-entered into life. Having identified the course of the sun god with that of man, and Ra with Osiris for a first day and a first night, it was hard not to push the matter further, and identify them for all succeeding days and nights, affirming that man and Osiris might, if they so wished, be born again in the morning, as Ra was, and together with him. If the Egyptians had found the prospect of quitting the darkness of the tomb for the bright meadows of Oalu a sensible alleviation of their lot, with what joy must they have been filled by the conception which allowed them to substitute the whole realm of the sun for a little archipelago in an out-of-the-way corner of the universe. Their first consideration was to obtain entrance into the divine bark, and this was the object of all the various practices and prayers, whose text, together with that which already contained the Osirian formulas, ensured the unfailing protection of Ra to their possessor. The soul desirous of making use of them went straight from his tomb to the very spot where the god left earth to descend into Hades. This was somewhere in the immediate neighbourhood of Abydos, and was reached through a narrow gorge or cleft in the Libyan range, whose mouth opened in front of the temple of Osiris Contamentit, a little to the northwest of the city. The soul was supposed to be carried thither by a small flotilla of boats, manned by figures representing friends or priests, and laden with food, furniture, and statues. This flotilla was placed within the vault on the day of the funeral, and was set in motion by means of incantations recited over it during one of the first nights of the year, at the annual feast of the dead. The bird or insect which had previously served as guide to the soul upon its journey now took the helm to show the fleet the right way, and under this command the boats left Abydos, and mysteriously passed through the cleft into that western sea which is inaccessible to the living, there to await the daily coming of the dying sun god. End of section 21. Chapter 3. The Legendary History of Egypt, Part 6. As soon as his bark appeared at the last bend of the celestial Nile, the Cynocephali, who guarded the entrance into night, began to dance and gesticulate upon the banks as they intoned their accustomed hymn. The gods of Abydos mingled their shouts of joy with the chant of the sacred baboons. The bark lingered for a moment upon the frontiers of day, and initiated souls seized the occasion to secure their recognition and their reception on board of it. Once admitted, they took their share in the management of the boat, and in the battles with hostile deities, but they were not all endowed with the courage or equipment needful to withstand the perils and terrors of the voyage. Many stopped short by the way in one of the regions which it traversed, either in the realm of Contamentate or in that of Socaris, or in those islands where the good Osiris welcomed them, as though they had duly arrived in the ferry boat, or upon the wing of thought. There they dwelt in colonies under the suzerainty of local gods, rich and in need of nothing, but condemned to live in darkness, excepting for the one brief hour in which the solar bark passed through their midst, irradiating them with beams of light. The few persevered, feeling that they had courage to accompany the sun throughout, and these were indemnified for their sufferings by the most brilliant fate ever dreamed of by Egyptian souls. Born anew with the sun god, and appearing with him at the gates of the east, they were assimilated to him, and shared his privilege of growing old and dying, only to be ceaselessly rejuvenated and to live again with ever-renewed splendor. They disembarked where they pleased, and returned at will into the world. If now and then they felt a wish to revisit all that was left of their earthly bodies, the human-headed sparrowhawk descended the shaft in full flight, alighted upon the funeral couch, and with hands softly laid upon the spot where the heart had been wont to beat, gazed upwards at the impassive mask of the mummy. This was but for a moment, since nothing compelled these perfect souls to be imprisoned within the tomb like the doubles of earlier times, because they feared the light. They went forth by day, and dwelt in those places where they had lived. They walked in their gardens, by their ponds of running water. They perched like so many birds on the branches of the trees which they had planted, or enjoyed the fresh air under the shade of their sycamores. They ate and drank at pleasure. They travelled by hill and dale. They embarked in the boat of Ra, and disembarked without weariness, and without distaste for the same perpetual round. This conception, which was developed somewhat late, brought the Egyptians back to the point from which they had started when first they began to speculate on the life to come. The soul, after having left the place of its incarnation to which in the beginning it clung, after having ascended into heaven and there sought congenial asylum in vain, forsook all havens which it had found above, and unhesitatingly fell back upon earth, there to lead a peaceful, free, and happy life in the full light of day, and with the whole valley of Egypt for a paradise. The connection, always increasingly intimate between Osiris and Ra, gradually brought about a blending of the previously separate myths and beliefs concerning each. The friends and enemies of the one became the friends and enemies of the other, and from a mixture of the original conceptions of the two deities arose new personalities, in which contradictory elements were blent together, often without true fusion. The celestial Horuses one by one were identified with Horus, son of Isis, and their attributes were given to him, as his in the same way became theirs. Apopi and the monsters, the hippopotamus, the crocodile, the wild boar, who lay in wait for Ra as he sailed the heavenly ocean, became one with Sit and his accomplices. Sit still possessed his half of Egypt, and his primitive brotherly relation to the celestial Horus remained unbroken, either on account of their sharing one temple, as at Nubit, or because they were worshipped as one in two neighbouring nomes, for example, at Oxyrhynchos and at Heracleopolis Magna. The repulsion with which the slayer of Osiris was regarded did not everywhere disassociate these two cults. Certain small districts persisted in this double worship down to the latest times of paganism. It was, after all, a mark of fidelity to the oldest traditions of the race, but the bulk of the Egyptians, who had forgotten these, invented reasons taken from the history of the divine dynasties to explain the fact. The judgment of Thot or of Sibu had not put an end to the machinations of Sit. As soon as Horus had left the earth, Sit resumed them, and pursued them, with varying fortune, under the divine kings of the second Ennead. Now, in the year 363 of Harmachis, the Typhonians reopened the campaign. Beaten at first near Edfu, they retreated precipitately northwards, stopping to give battle wherever their partisans predominated, at Zatmik in the Theban Nome, at Kait Nutrit to the northeast of Dendera, and at Hibonu in the Principality of the Gazelle. Several bloody combats which took place between Oxyrhynchos and Heracleopolis Magna were the means of driving them finally out of the Nile Valley. They rallied for the last time in the eastern provinces of the Delta, were beaten at Zalu, and giving up all hope of success on land, they embarked at the head of the Gulf of Suez, in order to return to the Nubian desert, their habitual refuge in times of distress. The sea was the special element of Typhon, and upon it they believed themselves secure. Horus, however, followed them, overtook them near Shas Hirit, routed them, and on his return to Edfu, celebrated his victory by a solemn festival. By degrees, as he made himself master of those localities which owed allegiance to Sit, he took energetic measures to establish in them the authority of Osiris and of the solar cycle. In all of them he built, side by side with the sanctuary of the Typhonian divinities, a temple to himself, in which he was enthroned under the particular form he was obliged to assume in order to vanquish his enemies. Metamorphosed into a hawk at the battle of Hibonu, we next see him springing onto the back of Sit under a guise of a hippopotamus. In his shrine at Hibonu he is represented as a hawk perching on the back of a gazelle, emblem of the nome where the struggle took place. Near to Zalu he became incarnate as a human-headed lion, crowned with the triple diadem, and having feet armed with claws which cut like a knife. It was under the form, too, of a lion that he was worshipped in the temple at Zalu. The correlation of Sit and the celestial Horus was not, therefore, for these Egyptians of more recent times, a primitive religious fact. It was the consequence, and so to speak the sanction, of the old hostility between the two gods. Horus had treated his enemy in the same fashion that a victorious pharaoh treated the barbarians conquered by his arms. He had constructed a fortress to keep his foe in check, and his priests formed a sort of garrison as a precaution against the revolt of the rival priesthood and the followers of the rival deity. In this manner the battles of the gods were changed into human struggles, in which more than once Egypt was deluged with blood. The hatred of the followers of Osiris to those of Typhon was perpetuated with such implacability that the nomes which had persisted in adhering to the worship of Sit became odious to the rest of the population. The image of their master on the monuments was mutilated, their names were effaced from the geographical lists, they were assailed with insulting epithets, and to pursue and slay their sacred animals was reckoned a pious act. Thus originated those skirmishes which developed into actual civil wars, and were continued down to Roman times. The adherents of Typhon only became more confirmed in their veneration for the accursed god. Christianity alone overcame their obstinate fidelity to him. The history of the world for Egypt was therefore only the history of a struggle between the adherents of Osiris and the followers of Sit, an interminable warfare in which sometimes one and sometimes the other of the rival parties obtained a passing advantage, without ever gaining a decisive victory till the end of time. The divine kings of the second and third Aeneid devoted most of the years of their earthly reigns to this end. They were portrayed under the form of the great warrior pharaohs, who from the 18th to the 12th century before our era extended their rule from the plains of the Euphrates to the marshes of Ethiopia. A few peaceful sovereigns are met with here and there in this line of conquerors, a few sages or legislators, of whom the most famous was styled Thought, the doubly great, ruler of Hermopolis and of the Hermopolitan Aeneid. A legend of recent origin made him the prime minister of Horus, son of Isis. A still more ancient tradition would identify him with the second king of the second dynasty, the immediate successor of the divine Horuses, and attributes to him a reign of 3,226 years. He brought to the throne that inventive spirit and that creative power which had characterized him from the time when he was only a feudal deity. Astronomy, divination, magic, medicine, writing, drawing, all the arts and sciences emanated from him as from their first source. He had taught mankind the methodical observation of the heavens and of the changes that took place in them, the slow revolutions of the sun, the rapid phases of the moon, the intersecting movements of the 5 planets, and the shapes and limits of the constellations which each night were lit up in the sky. Most of the latter either remained or appeared to remain immovable, and seemed never to pass out of the regions accessible to the human eye. Those which were situate on the extreme margin of the firmament accomplished movement there analogous to those of the planets. Every year at fixed times they were seen to sink one after another below the horizon, to disappear, and rising again after an eclipse of greater or less duration, to regain insensibly their original positions. The constellations were reckoned to be 36 in number, the 36 Decanti, to whom were attributed mysterious powers, and of whom Sothis was queen. Sothis transformed into the star of Isis when Orion, Sahu, became the star of Osiris. The nights are so clear and the atmosphere so transparent in Egypt that the eye can readily penetrate the depths of space, and distinctly see points of light which would be invisible in our foggy climate. The Egyptians did not therefore need special instruments to ascertain the existence of a considerable number of stars which we could not see without the help of our telescopes. They could perceive with the naked eye the stars of the fifth magnitude, and note them upon their catalogues. It entailed, it is true, a long training and uninterrupted practice to bring their sight up to its maximum keenness, but from very early times it was a function of the priestly colleges to found and maintain schools of astronomy. The first observatories established on the banks of the Nile seem to have belonged to the temples of the sun. The high priests of Ra, who, to judge from their title, were alone worthy to behold the sun face to face, were actively employed from the earliest times in studying the configuration and preparing maps of the heavens. The priests of other gods were quick to follow their example. At the opening of the historic period, there was not a single temple, from one end of the valley to the other, that did not possess its official astronomers, or, as they were called, watchers of the night. In the evening they went up to the high terraces above the shrine, or on to the narrow platforms which terminated the pylons, and fixing their eyes continuously on the celestial vault above them, followed the movements of the constellations, and carefully noted down the slightest phenomena which they observed. A portion of the chart of the heavens, known to Theban Egypt between the 18th and 12th centuries before our era, has survived to the present time.